When I think back on the strangest, most unsettling thing I ever experienced while camping, my mind always goes back to Arizona. It was supposed to be just another simple trip, nothing more than a weekend in the desert with my parents. We'd gone out there plenty of times before. They liked to get away from everything. No phones, no TVs, just a couple of folding chairs, a cooler, a tent, and the kind of open air you can only find in the desert. This particular trip was out near Tucson, close to Sabino Canyon. I remember the drive in, dust rising off the road behind us, jagged hills cutting against the sky, saguaros standing tall like guards watching the land. It felt so far removed from everything else, like stepping out of the regular world and into a place that didn't follow the same rules. The sun was harsh that day, the kind of dry heat that pressed against you from every side, but my parents always seemed to love it. We set up camp in a small clearing not far from the trail. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat patch of dirt that had been used by other campers before us. The desert stretched out in every direction, low shrubs, prickly pear, and the occasional tall cactus. The mountains in the distance were sharp and dry, glowing red as the sun started to sink lower. I could tell early on that my mom wasn't in the best mood. She and my dad had one of those small arguments that start over nothing. The cooler wasn't packed right, or maybe it was about where to set up the tent. I don't even remember the exact reason, only that she grew quiet and stiff while my dad went about hammering stakes into the ground. After a while, she announced she was going to take a walk. My dad didn't argue. He just kept working, and she slipped away down the narrow trail that wound deeper into the canyon. At first, it seemed harmless. She'd gone on little hikes before when she was frustrated, always returning calmer, with the edge gone from her voice. But this time, when she told me about it later, it wasn't just a normal walk. She followed the path for maybe 15 minutes, letting her footsteps crunch in the dirt, the sound of cicadas buzzing in the still air. The canyon walls rose higher the deeper she went, casting longer shadows. She was alone out there, nothing but the desert and the trail. Then she saw him. At first, it was just a shape moving in the distance, a man walking toward her along the same trail. She said she didn't think much of it at first. Plenty of people hiked in that area. But as he came closer, she realized something was very, very wrong. The man was completely naked, bare as the day he was born, striding down the trail without a single piece of clothing. He wasn't smiling or carefree either. She said he looked pissed off, his face tight, his brows drawn, his whole body stiff with tension. He didn't make a sound, didn't acknowledge her, didn't even glance her way as he passed. Just a naked, angry-looking man, walking alone in the middle of nowhere. She froze as he came near, every muscle tensing, unsure whether to turn back or keep going. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like she had stepped into something she wasn't meant to see. The strangest part was that he seemed to have no interest in her at all. He just kept walking, his eyes focused straight ahead, his pace steady and deliberate, as if she wasn't even there. She stood there long after he had disappeared down the trail, trying to process what she had just seen. The desert was silent again, but that image of the man burned into her mind. She said she felt her stomach twist in a way that was different from normal fear. It wasn't danger in the traditional sense. He hadn't threatened her or even spoken to her, but it was deeply unsettling. It was as if she had brushed against a hidden, strange world she hadn't known was there. When she finally turned back and walked quickly toward camp, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though the man had gone the other way. Every rustle in the brush, every shadow across the canyon wall made her heart jump. By the time she returned to us, she was pale and quiet, her earlier frustration gone, replaced with something closer to unease. Later, when she told us about it, we pieced together what had likely happened. Apparently, there's a nudist colony somewhere in the area near Sabino Canyon. It explained the naked man, at least. He wasn't lost, and he probably wasn't insane. He was just part of that community, taking a walk along the same trail she had chosen. But knowing that didn't really make it better. What stayed with her, and later with me when she told me the story, was the way he looked. Not relaxed or joyful, like someone embracing freedom, but angry, almost burdened. His presence had felt wrong, like stumbling across something you weren't supposed to witness. That night, as the sun fell and the desert went black around us, the story stuck in my head. The fire flickered against the shadows, and every time I looked out into the dark, I thought of that man, wandering naked through the canyon, his face locked in a grim expression. It made the darkness feel closer, heavier, as if there might be others out there just beyond the firelight, moving silently through the brush. We stayed the night, but I remember lying in the tent, staring at the nylon ceiling, unable to sleep. The desert silence that had seemed so peaceful earlier now felt sharp and pressing. Every time the wind shifted and the dry grass rustled, my body tensed. I kept picturing that man's stiff walk, his focused stare, and I wondered what would have happened if he had chosen to stop, or to turn his attention to my mom instead of ignoring her. She never went hiking alone again after that. Anytime we camped in Arizona after, she made sure she wasn't more than a few feet from us. And even now, when I think about that story, it leaves me unsettled. Not because there was any real danger, but because sometimes the strangest, most disturbing things aren't threats in the obvious sense. They're glimpses into lives and places you didn't expect to cross. For me, the lesson was simple. The desert holds more than just snakes, scorpions, and heat. Sometimes it holds people too. People you can't predict, people who move through it with reasons you may never understand. That night in Sabino Canyon reminded me that true fear isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's just the sight of an angry stranger walking naked down a trail, not looking at you, not saying a word, but leaving you with a feeling that follows you long after the desert has faded from view. I went on a group camping trip with some friends deep in the middle of nowhere in Arizona. It was one of those trips where you drive hours past small towns, then dirt roads, until you finally find a clearing that seems like a decent place to set up camp. The desert air was dry and still, the kind of silence that gets into your head. No cell service, no traffic hum in the background, just the crackle of our fire and the occasional desert insect buzzing past. We thought it was perfect. Nobody around to bother us, no rules, just us, our tents, and the stars overhead. That night, after a long day of hiking and drinking, we all settled into our tents. I was with a couple of buddies in mine, and across the clearing, the others had theirs set up. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the whole campsite was wrapped in heavy silence. I remember drifting off to sleep with that feeling of complete darkness pressing in from every direction, knowing we were far from anyone else. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was pitch black. The first thing I noticed was a sound, a slow, deliberate sniffing. It was faint at first, but it was right outside our tent, so close I could almost feel the air move with it. My heart jumped, and my immediate thought was that it was some animal. Maybe a bear, maybe a coyote, maybe something else that had wandered up because it smelled our food. I froze, holding my breath. A few seconds later, I felt one of my friends in the tent tense up next to me, and another one slowly put a hand on my arm. That tiny gesture told me we were all awake, all listening, all aware of what was happening just outside. The sniffing moved slowly along the side of the tent, dragging in close, as if whatever it was wanted to smell every inch. My mind raced. Did we tie up the garbage? Did anyone leave food out? Did we mess up? The sound shifted, moving away from us. Relief hit me for a split second until I realized it had gone straight to the next tent. The same slow sniffing started there, long, deep inhales like someone trying to memorize a scent. Inside my tent, none of us moved. My muscles ached from the tension of staying still, listening, waiting. Then came the worst part. One of the guys in another tent must have decided to handle it himself. I heard his zipper, then a sudden burst of noise, him yelling, screaming, trying to scare off whatever was outside. He had a gun with him too, so I figured he was banking on making enough noise to send the animal running. But it wasn't an animal. The moment he shouted, I heard quick, erratic footsteps, human footsteps, scrambling away from the tent. My blood went cold. That wasn't a bear sniffing around us. It was a man. Some stranger had come into our camp, gone through our coolers, and for whatever reason, decided it was okay to lean down and sniff our tents while we slept inside. Our friend chased him off into the dark, but the damage was done. Nobody felt safe anymore. We didn't bother trying to go back to sleep. We packed everything up as quickly as we could, tossing gear into trunks and beds of trucks, not even caring about neatness or order. All I could think about was how close that stranger had been. How if our buddy hadn't scared him off, we might have woken up to something far worse. By the time we drove out, it was still dark, the headlights carving the dirt road. All of us silent in our seats, wide awake and shaken. I thought that would be the end of it. I really did. But about a year later, the same group of us decided to camp in nearly the same area again. Looking back, I don't know if it was stubbornness or maybe just arrogance. We convinced ourselves it had been a one-time incident, some random drifter we'd never see again. To feel safer, we changed how we camped. Instead of sleeping in our tents on the ground, we all decided to sleep in the beds of our trucks and SUVs. We joked about it, saying nobody could sneak up on us like that again. From the outside, it looked like a smart idea, off the ground, out in the open, less vulnerable. That night, I fell asleep in the back of my SUV with my girlfriend next to me. The desert was just as still as the year before, the air crisp and dry, the silence heavy. A couple of friends had passed out near the campfire, their snores breaking the quiet here and there. I don't know how long I slept before it happened, but I woke up to something wrong. A bright light was shining directly into my face, the sharp glow cutting through my eyelids. Instinct screamed at me to sit up, curse, ask who the hell was doing that. But I didn't. I knew instantly this wasn't one of my friends. Something in the way the light held steady, focused, deliberate. It wasn't a joke. It was someone standing outside, shining a flashlight at me while I slept. I forced myself to keep my eyes shut, to keep my breathing even. I pretended to be asleep, every nerve on fire as I fought the urge to react. I prayed my girlfriend was doing the same. My heart was beating so hard I was sure it would give me away. After what felt like forever, the light moved away. I kept still, straining to listen. I heard footsteps crunching on the dirt, slow, unhurried. The man walked to the next truck, then the next, shining his light into each bed, pausing to stare at my friends as they lay there. None of them moved either. We were all just frozen, pretending to sleep, hoping he would go away. When I finally cracked my eyes open, I caught a glimpse of him. He was an older guy, standing there in the glow of his own flashlight, just watching. His movements weren't rushed, not nervous, calm, deliberate, like he was surveying us, taking his time. He didn't touch anything, didn't say anything, just stared at us one by one while we lay there, helpless and pretending to be asleep. Eventually, he walked away into the dark beyond our campsite. I waited until I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, then bolted upright. My chest felt like it was going to explode as I shook my girlfriend awake. She was already half awake, her eyes wide, the same fear I felt written all over her face. I scrambled out and ran to wake the others. One by one, we admitted we had all been awake, all pretending to be asleep, each of us paralyzed by the same fear. We hadn't said a word, but we had all understood how dangerous it was to let him know we were aware. We didn't waste time packing up neatly this time either. We grabbed what we could, threw it into the vehicles, and got the hell out. The drive back felt endless, headlights carving through emptiness, each of us replaying the scene in our heads. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just some drifter, maybe worse. But the way he stood there, calm and silent, watching us as we lay exposed, it was the most terrifying moment of my life. That was the last time I ever camped anywhere near Tucson. I can still remember that steady sniffing sound against my tent, and that bright flashlight beam burning through my eyelids. Those memories are enough to keep me away from the Arizona desert forever. I had been on plenty of camping trips before, but the one that stands out most vividly in my memory happened in the desert outside Tucson, Arizona. The desert always felt different from the mountains or the forests I had camped in before. There was a raw, exposed feeling to it. No trees to hide under, no streams trickling nearby, just dry earth, rocks, towering saguaros, and a silence that sometimes felt like it pressed down on your chest. You could see for miles in every direction, and still feel like someone could be standing just out of sight. We had picked a spot not far from a hiking trail, a patch of dirt that looked flat enough for tents. The day was typical Arizona heat, the kind that saps your energy if you don't drink water constantly. The air shimmered above the ground, and every rock felt like it radiated heat back into the air. The sun baked the landscape until evening finally came and the light softened, shadows growing long against the canyon walls. It was beautiful, but also unforgiving. That night was quiet. Too quiet, really. When you camp in a forest, there are always little noises. Rustling leaves, owls, frogs, crickets. Out there in the desert, when the wind died down, there was almost nothing. Just the occasional buzz of a cicada and the faint crackle of our fire. I tried to enjoy it, but I couldn't shake how exposed it felt. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to disappear if someone or something wanted to come walking through. I eventually crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and stretched out on my sleeping bag. The air had cooled quickly after sundown, the kind of temperature drop the desert is known for. I fell asleep staring at the nylon ceiling, comforted a little by the muffled sounds of my friends settling into their own tents nearby. I don't know how long I was out before I woke up, but it must have been well past midnight. My mouth was dry, and for a few moments I just lay there in the dark, listening. That's when I heard it, the crunch of footsteps on the rocky trail. Slow, deliberate, one after another, coming closer. My first thought was that maybe it was one of my friends getting up to take a piss or grab something from the cooler. But then I realized the sound was too steady, too measured. It wasn't the hurried shuffle of someone barefoot or half asleep. It was someone walking with purpose. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped just outside the glow of the fire's dying embers. There was a long silence, then movement again. I could make out a faint shape against the starlight, a person stepping into the open space near our camp. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as he came closer, I saw it clearly. He was naked. No shoes, no clothes, not even a bag slung over his shoulder. Just a man, walking barefoot through the desert in the middle of the night. His skin looked pale in the dim light, his body thin and wiry, his movements strangely calm. He didn't look around at the tents. He didn't say a word. He just walked with a kind of stiff determination, like he knew exactly where he was going. I lay there in my tent, completely still, my heart hammering in my chest. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to do something, to wake the others, to yell, but I couldn't. It felt like the second I made a sound, his head would snap toward me, and I didn't want that. So I stayed silent, peeking through a small gap in the tent's zipper, watching. He moved across our camp slowly, his bare feet crunching on gravel, occasionally stepping too close to a cactus or brush but never reacting. It was almost like he didn't feel pain or didn't care about it. He walked past the coolers, past the chairs, right through the middle of our little site. His face was set in a grim expression, his eyes locked straight ahead as if none of us existed. The strangest part was how deliberate he seemed. He wasn't wandering or stumbling. He wasn't confused. He wasn't drunk. He was focused, angry even, though I couldn't tell what at. That look stuck with me, the tight set of his jaw, the furrow of his brow, the way he carried himself. This wasn't some lost hiker who had gotten turned around. He belonged out there, somehow, and that realization made my skin crawl. I stayed awake the entire time he was in sight, not daring to move. My throat was tight, and the dryness of the desert air made it painful not to swallow, but I held it back. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, he passed through the other side of camp and disappeared back into the desert darkness, his footsteps fading until they were gone completely. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay rigid in my sleeping bag, listening to every sound, waiting for him to return. The stars overhead looked cold and endless, and every shadow outside my tent seemed alive. In the morning, I didn't know how to explain it. My friends woke up complaining about stiff backs and sore feet, none of them aware of what I'd seen. I didn't even tell them at first. I just sat there by the fire pit, staring at the trail he had come from, half expecting him to walk out again in the light of day. When I finally worked up the nerve to mention it, the reactions were a mix of disbelief and nervous laughter. A naked man wandering the desert? It sounded ridiculous, but I knew what I saw. Later, after we packed up and drove back toward Tucson, I thought about it the entire ride home. The desert is already dangerous enough. Snakes, scorpions, cactus spines, sharp rocks, and the brutal heat. Walking through it barefoot and unclothed made no sense. But the way he had carried himself, the anger in his face, the complete lack of reaction to pain, it still unsettles me. What scared me most wasn't that he was naked. It was that he didn't care. He wasn't lost or desperate. He was purposeful, moving through that empty space like he had somewhere to be. And I realized then that sometimes the scariest people aren't the ones who threaten you or yell or attack. Sometimes they're the ones who don't even acknowledge you at all. The ones so focused on whatever they're doing that you're just a shadow to them, something unworthy of notice. That night taught me something about camping in the desert. You can prepare for snakes, scorpions, or dehydration. You can bring food, water, sunscreen, and gear. But you can't prepare for the people you might cross paths with, the ones who don't play by the same rules, the ones whose reasons for being out there may never make sense to you. Since then, I've always been cautious about where I camp in Arizona. I stick closer to marked sites, even if it means giving up some of the solitude, because solitude cuts both ways. It's peaceful when you're alone with your friends and the stars, but it's terrifying when someone else walks out of the darkness, barefoot, naked, and angry-looking, reminding you that the desert doesn't belong to you and maybe never will. I've camped a lot of nights in the woods, but there's one night in particular that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. The strange thing is, nothing actually attacked me, nothing supernatural appeared, and no one jumped out of the trees. But the woods have this way of making the smallest sound feel enormous. And that night I learned just how thin the line is between confidence and raw, unshakable fear. It was late September, one of those weekends when summer still clings during the day, but the nights dip cold enough to make you wish for an extra layer. I'd picked a patch of state forest I'd been through before on day hikes, but never stayed overnight. The map showed a few backcountry sites along a long ridgeline, and I figured it would be a good solo trip to clear my head. I parked at a small gravel lot in the afternoon, shouldered my pack, and started down the trail. The forest was already quiet, that early fall hush where a lot of the birds have migrated but winter hasn't fully arrived. The crunch of leaves under my boots felt loud in the silence. The air smelled faintly sweet, the way it does when leaves first start to rot, mixed with the resin of pine and the dampness of earth. The hike was about 4 miles, not too bad, but enough to make me sweat under the weight of my pack. I passed through stretches of dense hardwood, the canopy filtering the sunlight down into shifting patches, then through sections of tall pines where the ground was carpeted in brown needles. Every so often I'd catch the flick of a deer's white tail bounding away, or the sudden chatter of a squirrel scolding me from a branch. By the time I reached the ridge, the sun was angling low. The site was just a small flat clearing tucked back from the trail, barely big enough for a tent and a fire pit ringed with stones. It overlooked a slope that dropped down into a tangle of brush and trees, with another ridge rising in the distance. The place felt secluded, perfect for the night. I dropped my pack, stretched, and got to work. The tent went up quick, just a 2-man dome I'd used a dozen times. I staked it down, unrolled my sleeping pad and bag inside, then gathered some sticks for a fire. There was plenty of dry wood scattered around, and soon I had a small blaze going, the flames snapping and sending sparks up into the air. Dinner was simple, ramen with a pouch of tuna stirred in. I sat cross-legged near the fire, slurping noodles, watching the light fade from the trees. The world dimmed in layers. First the sunlight slipped from the ridge opposite me, then the clearing darkened, then the fire became the brightest thing around. The air cooled fast, and I pulled my jacket tighter, holding my hands close to the flames. As the forest shifted into night, I started to notice the little sounds. Crickets chirping steady in the brush, a faint rustle of leaves every now and then, the distant call of an owl, low and echoing. Nothing unusual, but out there, those noises feel different when you're alone. They remind you that you're surrounded by life you can't see. By 10, the fire burned low. I poured some water over the coals, watched them hiss and fade to steam, then crawled into my tent. Inside, I wriggled into my sleeping bag, listened to the nylon crackle as I shifted, and settled in. The dark pressed close. My eyelids grew heavy. I don't know how long I slept before it happened. Maybe a couple hours. But suddenly, I was awake. At first I thought it was nothing. Just that strange sense you get when your body decides it's time to be alert. I lay still, heart beating a little faster, ears straining. Then I heard it. A sharp, forceful expulsion of air. Not quite a cough, not quite a snort. It was a harsh blow, like someone had sucked in a lungful of air and blasted it out in one violent burst. The sound came from just beyond my tent, maybe 10 feet away. Every muscle in my body locked tight. My mind jumped straight to a person. That's what it sounded like. Some guy standing in the woods at midnight, trying to get my attention. I held my breath, staring up into the dark, heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then it came again. A heavy, deliberate blow. Air forced out in a sudden rush. I'd spent enough nights outside to know this wasn't just some random noise. It was deliberate. A signal. My brain scrambled through possibilities. Human? Animal? What kind of animal makes a sound that close to a human cough? Another blow, this one closer. My skin prickled cold. I imagined someone standing there in the black trees, watching my tent, waiting for me to unzip it. I pictured a hunter, maybe, or some guy strung out and wandering the forest. The thought made my stomach lurch. Then I heard movement, leaves crunching, a step, then another. The sound circled slowly, deliberate, as if whatever it was walking a perimeter around my camp. I stayed frozen. My sleeping bag felt like a trap, holding me down. My knife was in my pack, out of reach. The only thing between me and the outside was a thin wall of nylon. The blows kept coming, spaced out. Each one made my heart leap. I'd never heard anything like it before. Wet, explosive, like a sneeze crossed with a cough. Finally, after what felt like forever, there was a crash of movement. Something bounded away through the brush, crashing down the slope with heavy steps. I lay there stiff, waiting, ears straining. The forest went quiet again, except for the steady rhythm of crickets. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay wide-eyed, heart thudding, listening to every rustle. At first light, I crawled out, body stiff, eyes gritty from lack of sleep. Mist hung low in the clearing, and the world felt damp and still. I walked the edge of the site, scanning the ground. That's when I saw the tracks. Hooves, clear as day. Deer. Relief hit me hard, mixed with something else. Unease. I realized then what I'd heard. Later I'd learn it's called blowing. Deer do it when they sense danger, when something feels off. They expel a sharp burst of air through their nostrils, loud and violent, to alert others. It wasn't some man standing out there coughing. It was a deer warning the rest of its kind about me. But here's the thing. Lying in that tent, not knowing, it had sounded human. Too human. In the dead of night, with nothing but thin fabric between me and the woods, it had felt like something else entirely. I packed up slow that morning, nerves still jangling. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I kept glancing over my shoulder, ears tuned sharp to the woods around me. In daylight, it all looked ordinary, just trees, just birds, just the forest doing what it always does. But I knew how it had felt only hours earlier. How quickly your mind can betray you when you don't know what you're hearing. That night taught me something important. Out there, it doesn't take much to unravel your sense of safety. Sometimes all it takes is a sound you can't place. A sound too close, too human. My brain had filled in the blanks with the worst possibilities, because fear always chooses the darkest path. I laugh now when I tell the story. It was just a deer, I say smiling, shaking my head, but I also tell the truth, that in the moment, it was one of the scariest experiences of my life. Because I didn't know. Because for long, tense minutes, I was sure something stood outside my tent, watching, waiting, breathing. And even now, when I'm alone in the woods at night, sometimes I remember that sound. The harsh, violent blow of air, and I feel that fear rise again, raw and sharp. The woods are alive with signals we don't always understand. That night, I got one meant for deer, and it rattled me to the core. I woke up to the kind of stillness that only happens deep in the woods, the sort of quiet that feels heavy and stretched out. At first, I didn't open my eyes. I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening. The air was cool, maybe mid-40s, and I could hear the faint snap and pop of cooling embers from the fire I'd let die down before crawling into the tent. It was morning. I could tell by the way the air smelled, damp, like wet pine needles and soil that had been sweating under the weight of the night. My tent was pitched in a clearing just far enough off the trail to be hidden, but not so far that I'd get lost wandering back. I'd hiked in late the previous afternoon, carrying just enough for a single night. My tent, a small stove, a little food, and my sleeping bag. The ground where I set up camp was fairly level, though one corner of the tent sloped a little, and I had ended up sliding into that edge more than once in my sleep. It didn't matter though. I was tired enough from the hike to sleep through it. When I finally opened my eyes, it took me a second to register the sound that had woken me. It was faint, soft at first, but not distant. A steady tapping. It wasn't woodpeckers or dripping rain. I'd heard both countless times before. This was heavier, slower, deliberate. Thud, pause, thud, pause. I sat up halfway, careful not to unzip the tent. The nylon walls barely moved as I shifted, but every little noise seemed too loud in that silence. The thudding kept on for a while, then stopped. I held my breath, waiting, listening. That was when I realized it wasn't just random forest noise. Something was close. I unzipped the sleeping bag and slid out, crouching low. I pressed my ear near the tent wall, straining to hear past the pounding of my own heartbeat. There was a scrape, the crunch of weight pressing into the soil, and then the unmistakable sound of wood being shoved or shifted against something solid. It hit me all at once. It was morning wood. Not in the stupid joke sense, but literally. Something or someone was dragging or moving fallen logs just outside my tent. The thought sent a cold ripple through me. The nearest campsite I had passed yesterday was more than a mile back. I hadn't seen another hiker all evening. Whoever was out there shouldn't have been. I stayed frozen, crouched, listening. The noise went on for what felt like forever. A dragging sound, a grunt, or maybe just air pushing through a nose. Then another heavy thud as wood dropped to the ground. I thought about unzipping the tent, about just looking, but every instinct told me to stay put. So I stayed low, waiting. After maybe 5 minutes, the noise stopped again. Total silence. That was somehow worse. When I finally built up enough nerve, I slid slowly onto my stomach, unzipped the door just an inch and peeked out. The early light was just beginning to filter through the trees. My fire pit was visible, gray with ash. Beyond it, maybe 20 feet away, was a pile of wood that hadn't been there when I went to sleep. Fresh logs stacked awkwardly, like someone had tried to set them down quietly and failed. I scanned the tree line, my eyes darting from one shadow to the next. Nothing moved. No figure, no animal, just the woods, calm and empty. I didn't know what to do. My pack was inside the tent with me, but if whoever stacked that wood was still close by, leaving now could mean running right into them. On the other hand, sitting there waiting felt even worse. I pulled my boots on and tied them tight, every knot trembling under my fingers. My water bottle was nearly empty, but I left it. Less weight meant faster movement if I had to bolt. I shoved everything into my pack in silence, rolling the sleeping bag loosely and stuffing it instead of bothering with straps. As I packed, I kept glancing out through the half-open zipper. The pile of wood sat there, harmless but wrong. That was what unsettled me most. It wasn't an accident. Someone had put it there. For what reason, I couldn't even begin to guess. When I finally stepped outside, the air bit into me sharper than before. The woods seemed brighter now, the sun rising somewhere beyond the ridge, but still dim enough that shadows stretched deep and long. I crouched by the fire pit, scanning again. Nothing. The pile of wood was maybe waist-high, stacked without care. Some of the logs were damp and mossy, the kind of stuff no one would actually bother using for firewood. I didn't touch it. I didn't even step closer. Instead, I slung my pack over my shoulders, tightened the straps, and started walking back toward the trail. Every footstep crunched on the damp needles, and every sound seemed too loud. I kept expecting movement behind me, a shape breaking out of the trees, but it never came. The trail was about 50 yards from camp, but it felt like half a mile. When I finally stepped onto it, I stopped and turned around one last time. From there, I could still see my tent, half collapsed now from being hurriedly emptied, and the pile of wood just beyond it, still untouched. It should have been funny in some strange way. Morning wood, left by some prankster hiker with nothing better to do. But the silence around it made it anything but funny. There had been no laughter, no sign of another person, no footprints I could see in the soil, just the stack of logs. I kept walking. The hike back out felt longer than the hike in. My senses were turned all the way up, noticing everything. The flap of wings when a crow burst from a branch, the creak of a tree shifting in the wind, the quick dart of a squirrel across the path. Each sound sent my pulse racing. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me. I stopped dead, listening. The forest answered with nothing but stillness. I waited, barely breathing, before pushing forward again, faster this time. By the time I reached the trailhead and saw my car parked at the gravel lot, my shirt was soaked with sweat despite the cool air. I tossed my pack inside, climbed in, and locked the doors before even catching my breath. Sitting there, staring out at the line of trees, I tried to make sense of it. Deer don't stack wood. Bears don't either. The wood wasn't dropped by accident, and it wasn't old. It had been moved fresh that morning. Someone had been there. Someone close enough to my tent to gather logs, to stack them, to do it all without ever making their presence fully known. And they hadn't tried to talk or laugh or scare me openly. They just left that silent pile as if it meant something. I drove away without looking back, the image of that stacked wood burning itself into my mind. The farther I got from the forest, the more the normal world began to return. Other cars on the road, the sound of the radio, people out walking dogs. But even then, a part of me stayed back there in that clearing. It wasn't the wood itself that got to me. It was the quiet intention behind it. The fact that someone was out there, close enough to touch my camp, and I never saw or heard them clearly. It was morning wood, but not the kind anyone jokes about. It was morning wood that told me, in the most silent way possible, that I hadn't been alone out there, and whoever was with me wanted me to know it. That thought still makes my stomach tighten every time I remember it. When I think back to that camping trip in the Chiricahua Mountains, it still makes my stomach knot a little, even though the story ended up being more strange than dangerous. At the time, though, it was terrifying, and it's something I'll never forget. My partner and I had only been together a couple of months. We were still in that early stage of figuring each other out, and to make matters worse, we had both quit smoking less than a week before the trip. The cravings were sharp, our moods weren't the best, and I was already a naturally anxious person. The idea of going into the mountains to meet his friends, many of whom I hadn't even met yet, had my nerves burning long before the engine even started. I cried quietly in the car as we drove, partly from the withdrawal, partly from the stress, and partly from the simple thought of not knowing what to expect. The drive itself was long, winding, and lonely. Once we got out into the real stretches of nowhere, the silence of Arizona's backcountry was overwhelming. Red earth and dusty pines blurred together, broken by sharp rock formations and steep drop-offs. We were hours from home, and the deeper we went, the less connected I felt to civilization. My chest tightened the higher we climbed, like I was being pulled away from every bit of comfort and familiarity I knew. The road was in rough shape, too. Potholes, sharp gravel, and washouts from the rains months before made the drive tense. Every time we hit a bump, I gripped the seat tighter, and then came the moment that nearly stopped the trip altogether. We hit a pothole so deep it felt like the tires had dropped into a sinkhole. The car jolted hard, bounced back up, and then sputtered. Seconds later, it shut off completely. I thought my heart was going to punch through my ribs. We coasted to a stop on the shoulder, dust rising around us. My hands shook. I had never felt so stranded. We were in the middle of nowhere, in the mountains, no cell service, no help nearby, and the car wouldn't start. My anxiety immediately jumped to the worst scenarios. What if we were stuck here? What if we never made it to the campsite? What if something worse came down that road and we had no way to leave? We pulled out the owner's manual and started flipping through it like desperate students cramming for an exam they hadn't studied for. Neither of us were mechanics, and at that moment it felt hopeless. Every car that passed was a reminder of our helplessness. A few drivers slowed down, leaned out their windows, and asked if we needed help. I was so wound up and on edge that I found myself blurting out strange things, even once asking if anyone had a cigarette, even though I knew I was supposed to be done with them. Each time they shook their heads, I snapped, telling them to move along. I wasn't myself. Anxiety and nicotine withdrawal had turned me into a version of myself I didn't even recognize. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only half an hour, we pieced it together. It was a safety mechanism, something triggered by the impact of the pothole that had shut the car down. Once we reset it, the car roared back to life, and I nearly cried with relief. But I was also drained, completely and utterly drained. By the time we rolled into the campsite and set up the tent, I felt like I had nothing left in me. My partner, however, seemed to find a second wind. Once the tent was up and the gear unloaded, he was eager to join his friends for a hike. I, on the other hand, could barely keep my eyes open. I told him I needed to rest and crawled straight into the tent. The nylon walls felt flimsy and thin, but I convinced myself that at least it was shelter. My body sank into the sleeping bag, and I closed my eyes, letting the exhaustion drag me under. But rest didn't come easily. I was in bear country. I knew it, and everyone else knew it. There had been recent sightings, and the thought of lying in a thin fabric tent in the middle of the wilderness while massive animals roamed nearby was enough to keep my heart thudding even as I tried to doze. Every snap of a twig, every shuffle of leaves outside, jolted me back to full awareness. Then it happened. I heard movement right outside the tent. Not the kind of small scurry a rabbit or squirrel would make. This was heavier, thudding steps, slow and deliberate. My breath caught. A shadow grew across the thin fabric of the tent wall, massive and looming. It stretched from one side of the tent to the other, blotting out the light. My blood ran cold. My mind filled in the blanks. Bear. A bear was standing outside my tent. The warnings I had heard replayed in my head, and my panic rose. I tried to think. Do I stay still? Do I run? Do I yell? The image of claws ripping through the nylon and teeth sinking into me was too strong to ignore. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get to the car, to get somewhere with solid walls and a locked door. The problem was, my glasses weren't on my face. I had left them outside, near my bag, because I had been too tired when I laid down. I couldn't see clearly, which made everything worse. The shadow was distorted, its shape strange and terrifying in my blurry vision. I tried to convince myself to stay calm, but my hands were already fumbling with the zipper of the tent. I unzipped it as quietly as I could, my pulse hammering so hard I thought it would echo into the night. I crouched low, preparing to dart to the car, when I froze. The figure was still there, broad and hulking, but then I saw something that made my brain stutter. A swinging tail. Wait, bears don't have tails. My confusion overtook my fear for just a moment. I reached for my glasses, slipping them onto my face with trembling hands. And then, finally, I saw the truth. It wasn't a bear. It was a cow. A big, lumbering, black and white cow, grazing its way right past the tent. I nearly laughed, but the adrenaline had nowhere to go. My body shook as I crouched there, watching this massive animal flick its tail and wander on. Relief washed over me, but it came mixed with something else. An uneasy realization. This was bear country, yes, but it was also free-range cattle country. Out here, you never really knew what might walk past your tent at night. I crawled back inside, my legs weak, my chest still tight. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound outside the tent reminded me of how exposed I was, how fragile that thin sheet of fabric was between me and the wild. By the time my partner returned from his hike, I was sitting upright in my sleeping bag, glasses on, wide-eyed and still replaying the moment in my head. The Chiricahua Mountains were beautiful, no doubt about it, but that trip left me with a lasting reminder. In Arizona, danger doesn't always come in the form you expect. Sometimes it's a bear, Sometimes it's a car breaking down in the middle of nowhere, and sometimes it's just a curious cow casting the wrong kind of shadow. But when you're alone in a tent, running on frayed nerves, your imagination can turn even the most harmless thing into something terrifying. That night taught me more about myself than I wanted to know. I learned how quickly fear can twist reality, how easy it is to let panic drive decisions. And I learned that when you camp in places like the Chiricahuas, you have to be ready for anything, because Arizona doesn't play by normal rules. When people ask me what scares me most about camping, they usually expect me to say bears, mountain lions, or maybe snakes. And sure, all of those are real threats. I've read enough stories and seen enough warnings to know they're out there. But the truth is, none of those things make my skin crawl as much as the idea of some random stranger showing up at my campsite in the middle of the night. Animals usually act on instinct, and in most cases you can figure out how to handle them. Make noise, store food properly, keep your distance. But a person? A stranger with unknown intentions in the wilderness? That thought terrifies me more than claws or fangs ever could. I learned just how real that fear can be on a camping trip I took in Arizona. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, nothing extreme. A couple of friends and I drove out to a spot well off the beaten path, a place surrounded by desert brush, tall saguaros, and jagged mountains in the distance. It wasn't an official campground, more of a dispersed camping area where people parked their trucks and set up tents where they pleased. That kind of isolation was exactly what appealed to us at first. We wanted to get away from city noise, from lights, from everything. Just quiet, fire, and stars. We got there late in the day, found a clearing not far from a dry wash, and set up our tents. The ground was hard, rocky, and uneven, but we managed to carve out a decent spot. After that, we lit a fire, cooked up some food, and settled in for what felt like a normal night. The desert cooled quickly once the sun dropped, and the air had that crisp bite to it that makes a fire feel like a necessity rather than a luxury. We talked, laughed, and eventually, one by one, crawled into our tents. I remember lying on my back in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of my tent, hearing the faint crackle of the fire dying down outside. My friends were already snoring lightly in their tents nearby. Everything seemed peaceful. I dozed off easily, wrapped in the kind of calm that only comes from being out in nature far from everything else. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. It wasn't from a dream, and it wasn't from any sound I could immediately place. I just had that uneasy sense, like something had shifted around me. The fire was out. The night was silent except for the occasional creak of branches in the wind. I laid still, ears straining for any sound. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Not the quick shuffle of a rabbit or the 4-beat pattern of a deer. These were slow, deliberate, heavy steps. They crunched against gravel and dry earth, moving in a way that was steady, human. My chest tightened instantly. I thought about animals first because that's what you're conditioned to think about when you camp. A bear? Maybe. But the steps didn't sound like an animal padding around. They had rhythm, heel to toe. One foot, then the other. Then came the sound that froze me in place. Breathing. Slow, steady, human breathing. Not a snort, not a sniff. Just the sound of someone exhaling as they moved closer to my tent. I didn't move a muscle. I held my breath and listened as the steps circled the tent, crunching against the dirt, pausing here and there. My heart thudded so loud I swore whoever was out there could hear it through the thin nylon walls. I told myself it could be one of my friends, but the problem was, all of them were in their tents. I could still hear the soft snores coming from both sides of me. The figure stopped right outside. That's when the outline appeared. A shadow against the dim starlight, tall and unmistakably human. Leaning close enough that I swore I could hear the faint rustle of clothing. The breathing was louder now, right outside the fabric, like they were standing there, listening, waiting. I gripped the inside of my sleeping bag so tight my hands cramped. I didn't dare unzip the tent, didn't dare shift or make a sound. The thin material separating me from whoever was out there felt like paper, useless against whatever they might decide to do. An animal might lose interest and wander away, but a person, especially one out here in the middle of nowhere, was unpredictable. The shadow lingered, then slowly it moved on. I listened to the footsteps drift toward the other tents. I thought about warning my friends, but panic held me in place. All I could do was lie there, staring at the roof of the tent, listening. The footsteps stopped again outside another tent. For a long moment, there was silence. Then the sound of something brushing against nylon, almost like fingers trailing along the fabric. My stomach dropped. It went on like this for what felt like forever. Whoever it was circled the camp, stopping at each tent, sometimes standing still for so long that I wondered if they were crouching down, looking inside through the mesh windows. The silence between the steps was worse than the sound itself. It gave me time to imagine what they might be planning, what they might be carrying, what they might want. At one point, I saw a faint glow. A flashlight beam cut across the ground, sweeping slowly. It wasn't bright, just enough to catch glimpses of rocks and brush. The person was searching, but for what, I didn't know. Eventually, after what must have been half an hour, the footsteps began to fade. The beam of light disappeared. The breathing, the rustling, it all stopped. I laid there rigid, every muscle aching from tension, straining to hear if they were really gone. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Every sound outside kept me on edge. I imagined footsteps even when there weren't any, convinced they might come back. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, my eyes felt raw from staying open so long. When my friends started unzipping their tents and stepping out, yawning and stretching, I was already sitting upright, my bag packed inside my tent. I didn't wait for them to ask questions. I unzipped my tent and looked around. There were footprints in the dirt, clear, unmistakable shoe prints circling all three tents. I knew then that it hadn't been a dream, and it hadn't been an animal. Someone had walked into our camp in the middle of the night and studied us while we slept. I told my friends what I had heard. They laughed it off at first, thought maybe it was just nerves or some animal moving strangely. But when I pointed out the tracks, human tracks, they went quiet. We didn't stick around to debate it. Within an hour, our tents were down, our gear was packed, and we were back on the road. The ride back was silent. I kept staring out the window, playing it over in my head, trying to figure out why someone would wander into a campsite like that. Were they just curious? Were they looking to steal something? Or was it something worse? Something we narrowly avoided by pretending to sleep and keeping quiet? That's what makes it scarier than any animal encounter. With a bear or a mountain lion, you at least know what you're dealing with. You can research, prepare, and have some idea of how to respond. But when it's another person, especially in the middle of nowhere, you can never know what's in their head. You can never know what they're capable of. That night in Arizona left me with a lesson I can't shake. Out there, surrounded by wilderness, the scariest predator isn't always on four legs. Sometimes it's the one walking quietly on two. I've always liked hiking at night. There's something about it that feels different than the day. Quieter, calmer, more raw. The woods or desert or mountains, wherever you are, take on a whole different personality when the sun goes down. A lot of people are scared of the dark out there, but for me, it feels more honest. You hear every sound clearer, you see movement in your peripheral vision, and you learn to trust your senses in a way most people never do. Artificial light, I always thought, ruins that. It blinds you to the bigger picture. That's why, on this particular trip, I insisted my brother and I hike without flashlights. It was late summer in Arizona, dry and warm, and we had spent most of the day on the trail. By the time we got off the main path, the sun had already slipped behind the ridge and the sky was settling into that deep blue twilight. We weren't in any hurry. We wanted to experience the trail in near darkness. I told my brother that our eyes would adjust, that we'd see more clearly without flooding our vision with a beam of white light. At first, he was skeptical, stumbling a little as the shadows thickened. But after about 20 minutes, he admitted he could see more than he thought. The road we were following back toward camp wasn't paved, just a wide dirt track used by trucks and hikers. With the moon rising, it had enough glow to make out the outline of rocks, trees, and the occasional cactus off to the sides. The desert was silent except for the crunch of our boots and the faint sound of night insects. It was the kind of quiet that settles in your chest and makes you hyper-aware of every movement around you. We had been walking for maybe half an hour when I saw them. A faint glow in the distance, bobbing slightly as it moved. At first I thought it might have been another pair of hikers with headlamps, but as we got closer, the glow sharpened into the steady flicker of a lantern. A couple, young, probably not much older than me, were walking down the same dirt road ahead of us. They were holding hands, the guy carrying the lantern low by his side. The way the lantern lit them up was strange. Everything around them was swallowed in darkness, but the flame painted their faces in sharp orange and gold. It made them look isolated, like they were on a stage while the rest of the desert was the audience. My brother and I, moving without lights, were invisible in the surrounding dark. We didn't try to sneak up on them. We weren't even moving quietly, we were just walking. When we got within about 50 feet, I lifted a hand and waved. The lantern light was bright enough that I thought they would have noticed us long before. We weren't trying to be creepy. We passed by on the left side of the road. I remember catching a glimpse of the girl's face, her expression calm, maybe a little distracted, like she was deep in thought. Then, just as we were even with them, she screamed. Not just a little startled yelp, but a full, sharp shriek that cut through the night air. "Oh my God!" I stopped dead in my tracks, my brother turning with the same confused look on his face that I felt on mine. My first instinct was to think something was wrong, that maybe she had seen something behind us, some animal or figure we hadn't noticed. But when I looked, there was nothing. The desert stretched out into the same emptiness it had the whole way back. Turned out the scream wasn't about anything behind us at all. It was about us. She told us she hadn't seen us until we were practically on top of them, 10 feet away at most. To her, we had materialized out of the dark, two silent figures emerging from the night with no warning. They had been blinded by their own lantern, its glow shrinking their vision to a small circle. We had been walking outside that circle, watching them long before they ever knew we were there. I remember standing there, suddenly aware of how we must have looked. Two shadowed figures with no lights, approaching steadily out of the dark desert. I wasn't sure whether to laugh it off or feel guilty. In her position, I probably would have reacted the same way. We kept walking after that, leaving the couple behind us, but the moment stuck with me. For the rest of the hike back, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the lantern had blinded them. The way our natural night vision had let us see them clearly while they couldn't see us at all. The way their scream had carried across the desert, raw and terrified, as if we had been something else entirely. It was a strange lesson, one I don't think my brother has ever forgotten. Hiking without flashlights gave us an advantage that night. We could see further, blend into the dark, move without announcing ourselves to everything around us. But that same advantage also made us something to be feared. To that couple, we weren't just two guys out for a night hike. We were the scariest thing imaginable, unknown figures appearing silently in a place where they thought they were alone. That's the part that stuck with me long after. In the wilderness, you expect to be cautious of animals or the environment itself. You don't expect other people to appear suddenly out of the dark. But the truth is, that's exactly what can happen. A flashlight can comfort you, but it also paints you into a circle of light, leaving the rest of the world invisible. Without one, you can see more clearly, but you also become the thing that people fear. By the time we got back to camp, the fire was out and the sky was filled with stars so thick it looked like dust scattered across black glass. My brother sat down heavily on a log, staring into the darkness beyond the circle where our tents were. He didn't need to say anything. I knew what he was thinking. The couple hadn't been wrong to be scared. In their place, we would have been just as shaken. That night, as I lay in my tent, I realized something I hadn't considered before. Sometimes, being unseen isn't just an advantage. It's a responsibility. You might know your intentions are harmless, but the people who can't see you don't. To them, you're just a shadow in the dark. And in the wilderness, a shadow can be the most terrifying thing of all. The lesson was simple, but it hit hard. Hiking without lights had shown us how sharp our natural night vision could be, how much farther we could see compared to someone carrying a lantern. But it also showed us the flip side of that coin. To others, we weren't just hikers. We were the kind of presence that could make someone scream in the middle of an empty desert road. Even now, years later, I remember the sound of that girl's scream echoing in the night. It was a reminder that fear isn't always about what you can see. It's often about what you can't. And sometimes, without meaning to, you become the very thing that makes someone else afraid. I was out camping with a friend in a forested area that wasn't far from home but felt like it could have been the middle of nowhere. We had hiked out earlier in the day, found a small clearing that had just enough room for our 2 tents, and set everything up before the sun went down. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavy, not quite hot, but not cool either. The stillness of the place gave me an odd kind of awareness, like every noise carried further than it should. By the time we had finished cooking a small meal and cleaning up, it was well into the night. The sky was black but filled with stars, and aside from the occasional breeze shaking through the trees, it was quiet. We crawled into our tents after talking for a bit by the fire. I lay on my sleeping bag, listening to the forest settle. It was that strange mix of peaceful and unnerving. Too much quiet can make you feel like something's about to happen. I must have dozed for a while, because when I stirred awake, the fire had burned down to nothing but faint glowing embers. My tent was dark, and the forest around us was silent again. That was when I heard it, a faint rustling near my tent wall. It wasn't the kind of movement leaves make in the wind. It was more deliberate, slow, steady, like something was dragging across the fabric or brushing close to it. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer sniffing around, which wasn't unusual for the area. I lay perfectly still, listening, trying to pick out the sound. Then came the sniffing. Long, slow, careful breaths, like something pressing its nose close against the thin nylon of my tent wall. The sound of it made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I tried to calm myself by thinking, it's just some curious animal, maybe looking for food scraps. That was what made the most sense. Still, there was something about the way it lingered, the way it moved with intention, that made me hold my breath. The sniffing moved from one side of my tent to the other, circling, pausing every now and then. My pulse quickened as I realized it wasn't just sniffing in one spot. It was moving like it was testing different areas, trying to decide something. I kept as still as I could, telling myself if I didn't make a sound, it would lose interest and wander off. I might have convinced myself of that too, if it hadn't been for my friend. Out of nowhere, I heard the quick zip of his tent opening. He must have woken up too, probably hearing the same thing I did. His sudden movement broke the silence, and right after that, I heard fast, retreating footsteps. Not animal steps either. Heavy, human. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me like a weight. This hadn't been an animal sniffing around our tents. It had been a person. Someone had been outside in the dark, close enough to breathe against the thin walls separating me from them. I could still hear the sound of the footsteps fading into the woods, quick and sharp. Nothing like the shuffle of a deer or the light scurry of a raccoon. I sat there frozen, listening to the silence settle back in around us. My friend shined his flashlight out into the trees, but the beam barely cut through the thick dark. There was nothing to see anymore. Whoever it was had already slipped away into the woods. The fear didn't fade. If anything, it got worse the longer I thought about it. An animal might have been after food. An animal might sniff and leave. But a person out here, moving that quietly, close enough to touch the tents without saying a word. There was no reason for that except one I didn't want to dwell on. Neither of us slept much for the rest of the night. Every twig snap, every shift of wind, made me tense up all over again. My mind replayed that slow sniffing sound against the thin fabric, knowing now what it really was. My tent had felt like such flimsy protection, like one thin barrier that could be unzipped in an instant if someone wanted to. By morning, the woods felt almost normal again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the sounds of birds carried through the clearing like nothing had happened. But when I stepped outside, I looked around carefully. The ground near our tents was disturbed, not in a wild animal's way, but in the shape of boots pressed into the dirt. The prince circled both tents before heading off deeper into the forest. We packed up fast. The hike out felt longer than it had on the way in, like every turn in the trail might reveal whoever had been there the night before. We didn't talk much as we walked, both of us replaying what had happened in our own heads. When I finally got back to my car, the relief was overwhelming. Closing the doors, starting the engine, feeling that barrier of steel and glass between me and the woods made me realize how vulnerable I had felt all night. Out there in the tents, someone had crept close enough to breathe against us, close enough that if my friend hadn't made a sound, I might not have known it wasn't an animal at all. What scared me most wasn't just that someone was there, but that they were so quiet, so patient, and so close. They hadn't tried to talk, hadn't asked for help, hadn't made themselves known in any normal way. Whoever it was, they had been testing the edges of our space, and I would never know what they wanted, or what might have happened if my friend hadn't unzipped his tent when he did. That night taught me more than any story about wild animals or rough weather ever could. Out in the woods, it isn't the wildlife that scares me the most. It's the thought of another person, silent and watching, close enough to touch the walls of my tent, waiting for me not to notice. I was out camping with a friend in a forested area that wasn't far from home but felt like it could have been the middle of nowhere. We had hiked out earlier in the day, found a small clearing that had just enough room for our 2 tents, and set everything up before the sun went down. It was one of those nights where the air felt heavy, not quite hot, but not cool either. The stillness of the place gave me an odd kind of awareness, like every noise carried further than it should. By the time we had finished cooking a small meal and cleaning up, it was well into the night. The sky was black but filled with stars, and aside from the occasional breeze shaking through the trees, it was quiet. We crawled into our tents after talking for a bit by the fire. I lay on my sleeping bag, listening to the forest settle. It was that strange mix of peaceful and unnerving. Too much quiet can make you feel like something's about to happen. I must have dozed for a while, because when I stirred awake, the fire had burned down to nothing but faint glowing embers. My tent was dark, and the forest around us was silent again. That was when I heard it, a faint rustling near my tent wall. It wasn't the kind of movement leaves make in the wind. It was more deliberate, slow, steady, like something was dragging across the fabric or brushing close to it. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer sniffing around, which wasn't unusual for the area. I lay perfectly still, listening, trying to pick out the sound. Then came the sniffing. Long, slow, careful breaths, like something pressing its nose close against the thin nylon of my tent wall. The sound of it made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I tried to calm myself by thinking, it's just some curious animal, maybe looking for food scraps. That was what made the most sense. Still, there was something about the way it lingered, the way it moved with intention, that made me hold my breath. The sniffing moved from one side of my tent to the other, circling, pausing every now and then. My pulse quickened as I realized it wasn't just sniffing in one spot. It was moving like it was testing different areas, trying to decide something. I kept as still as I could, telling myself if I didn't make a sound, it would lose interest and wander off. I might have convinced myself of that too, if it hadn't been for my friend. Out of nowhere, I heard the quick zip of his tent opening. He must have woken up too, probably hearing the same thing I did. His sudden movement broke the silence, and right after that, I heard fast, retreating footsteps. Not animal steps either. Heavy, human. My stomach dropped. The realization hit me like a weight. This hadn't been an animal sniffing around our tents. It had been a person. Someone had been outside in the dark, close enough to breathe against the thin walls separating me from them. I could still hear the sound of the footsteps fading into the woods, quick and sharp. Nothing like the shuffle of a deer or the light scurry of a raccoon. I sat there frozen, listening to the silence settle back in around us. My friend shined his flashlight out into the trees, but the beam barely cut through the thick dark. There was nothing to see anymore. Whoever it was had already slipped away into the woods. The fear didn't fade. If anything, it got worse the longer I thought about it. An animal might have been after food. An animal might sniff and leave. But a person out here, moving that quietly, close enough to touch the tents without saying a word. There was no reason for that except one I didn't want to dwell on. Neither of us slept much for the rest of the night. Every twig snap, every shift of wind, made me tense up all over again. My mind replayed that slow sniffing sound against the thin fabric, knowing now what it really was. My tent had felt like such flimsy protection, like one thin barrier that could be unzipped in an instant if someone wanted to. By morning, the woods felt almost normal again. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the sounds of birds carried through the clearing like nothing had happened. But when I stepped outside, I looked around carefully. The ground near our tents was disturbed, not in a wild animal's way, but in the shape of boots pressed into the dirt. The prince circled both tents before heading off deeper into the forest. We packed up fast. The hike out felt longer than it had on the way in, like every turn in the trail might reveal whoever had been there the night before. We didn't talk much as we walked, both of us replaying what had happened in our own heads. When I finally got back to my car, the relief was overwhelming. Closing the doors, starting the engine, feeling that barrier of steel and glass between me and the woods made me realize how vulnerable I had felt all night. Out there in the tents, someone had crept close enough to breathe against us, close enough that if my friend hadn't made a sound, I might not have known it wasn't an animal at all. What scared me most wasn't just that someone was there, but that they were so quiet, so patient, and so close. They hadn't tried to talk, hadn't asked for help, hadn't made themselves known in any normal way. Whoever it was, they had been testing the edges of our space, and I would never know what they wanted, or what might have happened if my friend hadn't unzipped his tent when he did. That night taught me more than any story about wild animals or rough weather ever could. Out in the woods, it isn't the wildlife that scares me the most. It's the thought of another person, silent and watching, close enough to touch the walls of my tent, waiting for me not to notice.